world is changing in many different ways. We have rising temperatures, we have more people than ever, we have forests disappearing and fires becoming more frequent. There's lots of different ways that the world is changing, and it's also changing very fast. Of course, we've always had fires and we've had forests come and go, but now the temperature is rising faster than ever, and these changes are all happening at a pace that's never been seen before. Now, how are the animals doing? Well, some animals are doing fine. Some animals, like raccoons, do quite well in this new world, and the temperature is not too bad for them, so they're quite abundant. Other species, like the Sumatran rhino, are not doing fine. They're really struggling to survive facing all these changes. And so our challenge really is, how can we help wildlife survive in this rapidly changing world? And there's really basically two options. One is we can protect them from change, and the other is we can try to help them adapt to the change. So I'm going to give you one example from the Kirtland's warbler, which is a bird that we were able to protect from change. They were a species that almost went extinct due to habitat loss and also invasive species, so that in 1987 they were down to only 167 breeding pairs living in a small part of Michigan. But we were able to protect their habitat, get rid of the invasive species, and restore and actually grow more habitat. And now we're up to over 2,000 pairs living not only in Michigan, but they've also established populations in Wisconsin and Ontario. So this species is really doing much, much better because of our protection. Now, another example of a species that was able to adapt once we gave it some protection are wolves. Wolves are another species that were almost hunted out of the United States, so that by 1950, there was only a handful of animals surviving in the lower 48 states, up in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And they were wiped out from almost all of Europe. But then they were protected by the Endangered Species Act and other laws that prevented hunting. And they were reintroduced in Yellowstone, and they really started taking off and really thriving, not only in the Great Lakes, but now they're across much of the Western United States, and a surprising amount of Europe now has wild wolves. And what's interesting is not only has this protection helped them recover their population, but it's also allowed them to adapt and change their behavior to deal with this modern world in a better way. So I really like this example from the Great Lakes areas, up in Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota. The population has really grown over time. You can see the number of wolves up to now 700s, and the number of packs also increasing. But over this time, we've been studying their ecology, and there was a study in 1999 that said, well, there's a threshold of road density that they can occur at, which is 0.45 kilometers of road per kilometer squared. So that means anywhere that there were more roads than that, there were no wolves. Well, then a little bit longer, they said, well, let's look again. They found, oh, hey, they're living at higher road densities, 0.7. So it's about double the road density that we used to think they're able to survive. And then just a couple years later, the mean road density was 0.8, meaning the average of all the areas. So they really were moving out and able to deal with areas that had more roads and therefore more people over just a few decades. So I think this is really cool because it shows you how if you give animals some protection, they can adapt. Some of them, in some ways, can adapt and live alongside of us. And so this is really the task of wildlife management, to evaluate the results of our management and then fine-tune the next round. And we have to do this in all these changing conditions, right? The world is changing. It's getting warmer. There's more people. There's all these things about the planet that's changing, but also the species that we're trying to monitor are also changing. They're not the same that they were 100 years ago. And so this requires a lot of information. We need to know what to do, where and when, and we need new information, new data every year because things are always changing. So what I want to do today is introduce some of the new technologies that bring big data to wildlife conservation to meet this information need, and also show how these help us protect wildlife and encourage their adaptation into the Anthropocene. So I'm going to talk specifically about wildlife technology, two things that I use a lot in my research. One are GPS tracking tags, and the other are camera traps, these motion sensitive cameras that you can leave out to get records of which animals live where. And I want to start with the tracking tags because these have really come a long way, and it's really amazing what you can do with these little backpacks on birds or little collars on animals. And this is a great egret that we tracked on the coast of North Carolina, lived on the Outer Banks. And one day this animal was nesting up there, and one day it suddenly flew right out off the Outer Banks into the open ocean. And if you were just sitting there, you would have never known where it was going. and it landed later that same day in the Bahamas. And those little colors are showing you the wind speed, so it had a tailwind. It went on down to Jamaica and spent the winter, in fact, in South America. So this is an incredible journey of an animal. Who knows how it even knew to fly south like that? And it shows you what this tracking tags can get us. Now, I'll show you another animation. Now, instead of just one animal, this is thousands of animals of all different types. We've got seabirds, water birds, raptors, and some terrestrial and marine mammals, all colored differently here, moving in the Arctic. And this shows you what scientists can do when they come together to share data with each other and look at, in this case, the seasonal movements of these animals as they come and go. And we've also looked at this over the years and seen how animals are changing their behaviors due to climate change in this very sensitive part of our planet. So next, I want to tell a little bit of a story of one of my research projects that came largely from these GPS tracking tags. And this is working on fishers. Fishers are a kind of a big weasel or a small wolverine. And when I learned about them, they were super rare and they were really considered a wilderness species. Fishers were trapped almost to extinction, so that by the 1920s or 30s, there were only a handful of them left, and luckily we were able to put in trapping regulations to protect them, and their population slowly recovered. But still, by the 90s, they were considered a habitat specialist that required mature forests, sort of this wilderness species. They've made recoveries quite a bit, especially in the east. In the West, and they still need a little bit more help. But so you can imagine, I was really surprised to find them living in Albany, New York. This suburban area, there's some forests and some neighborhoods, kind of the last place you would think you'd find this wilderness specialist. But there they were, living in this area. Here's an animal with a radio collar, one of these GPS collars that we put on to get a really good idea of where they were going. And this high resolution tracking data showed us some amazing things of just how intertwined these animals were with some of our neighborhoods, really avoiding the neighborhoods, but going all the way around them and using the forest basically in people's backyards. But not only using the forest, but using some of these sort of unclaimed habitats at night. So here's a golf course at night in the winter. There's nobody golfing out there, but there's a lot of rabbits running around, and the fishers know it, and that's what they're hunting there. We also had them amazingly using these little scraps of forest right alongside the road, inside one of these on-ramp clover leaves. That there would be a wilderness species living in there is just amazing. It shows you how much they're not a wilderness species anymore, how much they've changed and adapted, and how did they cross these roads? That must be really dangerous, you would think. How would an animal survive crossing, that's a major like 8-lane interstate? Well, we put a camera there and we found that in fact, they were using these tiny little culverts to get back and forth. These drainage culverts, not what you would think would be, a great wildlife underpass, but just these little tunnels. Weasels, they're a member of the weasel family, they love tunnels, and they're able to use this to go under the road instead of going over the road where they might get hit. So this shows you how the fisher has evolved from being a wilderness specialist to being now basically a suburban squirrel and rabbit hunter in about 50 years. And it shows an example of how if you protect a species from overharvest, they can recover and find new ways to survive in the modern world. Now, I want to show you one more example of our research using this other technology, camera traps, right? So these are motion-sensitive cameras you can put out there and just let sit there for months and learn what's going on in a given area, which animals live there, without actually catching animals and putting tags on them. And so we did this work in suburban areas. We wanted to compare directly suburban animals to wild animals. So we worked with citizen scientists who put cameras right in backyards, and then also out in the small forest fragments kind of around neighborhoods, and then out in the truly wild areas. And we found a ton of wildlife living really close to people. Some species that were more common really out in the wild areas, but overall, the levels of diversity and animal activity were similar in the wild and the suburban landscapes. And the most important thing in the suburban areas was the presence of green space that was the most critical factor to help the species survive in these areas. So this kind of wild suburbia highlights the adaptability of animals when given some protection, and is an encouraging sign in a rapidly urbanizing world. Life can find a way. So there's a lot of good things happening right in our backyards when we protect these animals and let them sort of find their ways to adapt. But I also want to point out that there are limits to adaptation, right? The Sumatran rhino is not going to be a backyard species. Some species need more time, some species need more space, and so we have to have this combination of protection and sort of encouraging and helping species adapt. So to kind of wrap things up, I hope you see animals can adapt to changing conditions, but there are limits to how much and how fast. And we can manage for this adaptation if we know which species are doing well and which are struggling and why. And technology can help us get the data we need, not only for management to figure out, okay, what can we do to save this species, but also to tell the stories of these animals, because these stories about adaptation and conservation success are really important to foster optimism. And conservation needs optimism badly to engage people in not just worry about the doom and gloom, but realize that there is hope and we can make a difference. And even in this changing world, we can have healthy wildlife populations.